Watcher everyone, this is the second part of a look into the history of fighting games, so if you've not already checked out the first half, I highly recommend you do. It's not essential viewing, but I'm going to be picking up right from where we left off. With that said, this is TAC, let's get going. By the mid-90s, Street Fighter 2 no longer had a grapple hold over the genre, and Mortal Kombat and Virtua Fighter series were the go-to cabinets in the arcades. Newcomer Tekken released in arcades in 1994, but it was the port in 1995 that would prove critical to the PlayStation's success that made it a mainstay of the genre. Whilst being compared unfavourably in terms of its graphics to the likes of Virtua Fighter 2, it was praised for its impressive controls, lots of fighters and strategic gameplay. It was a game that perhaps didn't break new ground, but brought a quality to lots of things that people would expect from a fighter. Perhaps what it offered more than anything else was lots of new content for home gamers to get their grubby mitts on. It spawned several sequels, and Tekken 8 was announced in 2022 by Bandai Namco. Virtua Fighter 3 was the most anticipated new title in 1996 and was very well received on its release. It was criticised for the two new characters not having enough interest to sway a new audience, but it was praised for its cinematic-like graphics and its combat innovations. It was ported over to the Dreamcast less than a year later, where its success seemed assured, but we all know what would eventually turn out there. Street Fighter 3 finally released in 1997 but failed to have the impact of its earlier titles. It was not the innovative game that many had hoped for. Many had expected Street Fighter to make the leap towards 3D, and while its 2D graphics and controls were described as flawless, other titles such as Mortal Kombat and Virtua Fighter were now able to keep pace in this respect a lot more. One reviewer at the time said of it, "Besides the stunning graphics, there's little to distinguish it from the 11 other titles." The Soul Calibur series kicked off in 1995 with Soul Edge, first released in arcades and then ported onto the PlayStation, where it was titled Soul Blade outside of Japan. It focused on weapons-based combat and included a variety of game modes beyond the one-on-one versus modes, like time attack, team battles and survival modes. It was praised graphically for its fluid movement and also for its soundtrack. It didn't fare as well as some other titles, such as the Tekken series, but its PlayStation port did well and it became a bestseller in the UK, gaining enough popularity to assure it multiple sequels. Dead or Alive released in 1996 and was ported to the Saturn in 1997, although it never saw an EU or NA release on a console. It also came to the PlayStation in 1998. It reaped praise for its large roster of fighters and movesets and for the inclusion of its danger zones, which offered environmental hazards. It stood out in that it replaced the typical guard button with a hold button instead, which would attempt to grapple opponents as they made their attacks. Its use of holds and counter holds gave it an almost rock paper scissor like feel, and it was a new string on the bow of competitive fighting games for veteran players to get their heads and hands around. Although some suggested that it was strikingly similar to Virtua Fighter 2, in many respects it stood out where it had changed up the typical fighter formula. To round off the turn of the century, a new style of fighting game came onto the scene. There was interest in fictional crossovers which featured characters from multiple franchises, and X-Men vs Street Fighter released in 1996, which would go on to become the Marvel vs Capcom franchise. Capcom had been working on separate fighters within the Marvel universe, releasing X-Men Children of the Atom in 1994, which was based on the X-Men cartoon. The sprites from that game were used to draw those for the X-Men vs Street Fighter title. Interestingly, instead of using the typical 3-round one-on-one fights, XM vs SF opted for tag team fights and allowed players to switch out their fighters as they saw fit. This created a new level of skill for veteran fighter players, as the dormant character was also able to recoup some of their health. It was also possible to unlock movesets that allowed for both members of the team to damage the opponent, and we know by now just how much gamers love finding those secret special moves. It reviewed well, and it was a popular title on the arcade floors. Although there were still successes to call out into the 2000s, there was a noticeable decline in the popularity and sales of fighting games, both in the arcades and home consoles. In retrospect, there were a few key factors that led to this. Not least was the oversaturation of the genre. A slew of releases that had often felt very similar to one another left gamers wanting something different. Developers also doubled down on fan preferences, making individual franchises more niche with increasing complexity, which left casual players struggling. Specialisation of favoured characters and their movesets further added to this complexity, and the rise of focused competitive play drove out many gamers unable to devote considerable time to specific titles. The arcade floor was increasingly becoming hostile to the new player. The more general decline in the popularity of arcades around this time didn't help either and just added to the woes. Home consoles became big business, but they'd also become powerful, able to replicate the gameplay and graphics of their arcade ports. Given the choice, lots of gamers chose the option to stay at home and play in the comfort of their favourite chair. Whilst the fighting game was in decline, there was still a regular flow of new titles and updates to existing franchises. Dead or Alive, Soul Calibur, King of Fighters and Tekken were regularly releasing titles through the 2000s, being ported onto the home console so a new generation of gamers could experience what they had to offer. Guilty Gear X released in 2000 and 2001, and its sequel Guilty Gear XX received critical acclaim. Beyond its fluid gameplay and anime-inspired themes, it was praised for its graphics, brutality done beautifully as one reviewer put it. Tapping into its anime roots, it added extra flair to its environments, the characters who inhabited them, and the moves they pulled off. Viewed simply by some due to its 4-button control scheme, it had a few tricks under the hood that saw it gain its own fanbase. For one, it introduced the Roman Cancel, a play on words of Roman candle, which allowed players to cancel moves and their after effects to respond quickly with different attacks. It also had a tension gauge which decreased or increased depending on how aggressive a player was. If this gauge was filled, fighters had an opportunity to attempt an instant kill, regardless of the opponent's health. The game then encouraged aggressive matches and shied away from defensive or turtling matches. It found its place among the other regular titles and has seen releases even on the newest generation of consoles. The 2000s also saw the growth of the indie developer as fully featured game engines became available to anyone with a computer willing to put in the work. One standout indie fighter, which was released in 2002, kicked off the Melty Blood franchise, which would go on to include arcade titles and manga series. The first title, the franchise's namesake, offered several unique mechanics which allowed it to find its place within the elite of fighting games. It features shielding, which allowed players to completely nullify damage in certain circumstances, and a mechanic called reverse beat, which allowed players to cancel combos but maintain weaker movesets. It was also characterised by its freedom of movement, allowing jumps, double jumps, super jumps and air dashes which could be combined to create unpredictable movements not typically possible in other fighters. In 2008, Super Smash Bros. Brawl was released on the Nintendo Wii as a crossover fighting game. It garnered critical acclaim and was a runaway commercial success. Nintendo had released the first Smash Bros. In 1999 onto the N64 and it had been received very positively. However, where the original game included 12 playable characters, the 2008 follow-up would include a total of 39 characters on its roster. This included characters like Link, Fox and Samus Aran, but also the likes of Solid Snake and Sonic the Hedgehog. In short, it was a big deal to people who enjoyed fighters, but also anyone that had more than a passing interest in the games industry as a whole. It also doubled down on its single-player modes. It included the expansive gameplay mode Subspace Emissary, which featured a unique storyline, side-scrolling levels, unique bosses and a detailed plot with cutscenes. While the genre generally became far less popular than it once was, arcades and their attendant fighting games remained reasonably popular in Japan and continue to do so even today. Virtua Fighter 5, for example, lacked an online mode, but still achieved success both on home consoles and in the arcades. Players practiced at home and went to the arcades to compete face-to-face with opponents. Street Fighter 4, the series' first mainline title since 1999, a decade earlier, was released in early 2009 to critical acclaim onto home consoles. It had already garnered praise from its release onto Japanese arcades in 2008. Its success sparked a renaissance for the fighter, introducing new players to the genre. With the increased audience, there was also the opportunity for other fighting game franchises to achieve successful revivals of their own. A revamped Mortal Kombat released in 2011 to critical acclaim. It was considered to be a fitting reboot to the series, but rather than just relying on its nostalgia, it offered a step up in terms of gameplay. It was lauded for its immersive and expansive single-player campaign, and whilst it perhaps fell short of the technical finesse of Street Fighter 4, it was by all accounts an amazing cracking game. Dead or Alive 5 arrived in 2012, gaining a similar attention to Mortal Kombat. It was praised for being a great all-round fighter that both looked and felt sublime to play. The development of its highly destructive arenas made the world more interactive than ever before, and the game was rendered in a much more realistic visual style than previous titles, including fighters getting sweaty and clothes getting dirty. Breast physics had always been a point of contention in the franchise, and DOA 5 was no different, including costume-specific breast physics and semi-transparent clothing. In the same year, another indie title proved popular. Skullgirls, developed by Revenge Labs, is a tag team based fighter which takes place in Canopy Kingdom, a country reminiscent of 1940s post-war United States. It featured 8 playable characters and was loved for its presentation of hand-drawn character art. It garnered some attention for its sexualized all-female cast, some of the outfits and animations being deemed unnecessary or fetishistic. It was, however, also praised for its gameplay and system mechanics and for its involved tutorial, which introduced new players to the tropes of the fighting genre. Never one to miss an opportunity to make a bit of money, Ubisoft announced in 2019 that the free-to-play platforming fighting game Brawlhalla reached 20 million players, with it climbing to 80 million by 2022. And so as we gaze ahead in what's in store, we see a bright sunny horizon for the fighter. Street Fighter 6 released in June, Tekken 8 was announced for a late 2023-2024 release, Dead or Alive 7 is looking at a mid-2024 release, and Soul Calibur 7 looks towards a late 2025, early 2026 release. I really hope this video has given you an insight into the messy, turbulent and wonderful world of the fighting game. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving me a subscribe so I can make more of these. Pop us a comment and let me know what else you'd like to see me do stuff on. In the meantime, I've been Tack, and you've been just marvellous.